Hello, this is Mike Swanson, and this is an episode of The Past American Century. I didn't do one last week. I went out of town. I went on a little bit of a vacation, but I'm trying to do an episode every single week. I want to do these on a regular basis because I believe they're important. And somebody sent me a question, or they asked me a question, I should say, a couple months ago that got in my head again recently, and they were asking me, is interest in the Kennedy assassination dying out? First of all, it's not going to die out as long as there's people engaged in the topic and willing to share their interest with other people. And that's what I'm trying to do with this YouTube channel, is get good information out there, interview people that are top researchers, and hope that helps get their info out there and encourages others to want to learn more. But I need your help in doing that. If you would, share my videos of others, and to help get YouTube to do that too, subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit that bell button below the video. Then you get notifications when the next video is put up. And when YouTube sees people do that, then they know, oh, people like this stuff, and they end up showing it to more people in their algorithms. Now, that said, is interest in the Kennedy assassination dying out? It's changing, it's evolving, it's going to continue to do that, but it's not dying out. Let me show you why I can tell that to you. Take a look at this chart. What you're looking at is Google Trends, and that line is interest over time. This is the number of searches people, or number of times people are putting in the word JFK assassination and related terms inside the Google search engine. Now, of course, you can see it had a massive spike that happened in 2013 on the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. However, if you take that spike off this chart, then it's pretty steady. There's no massive drop-off happening. In fact, in 2017, there was a spike then. That happened when the new JFK files were released, or I should say some old, still classified files were declassified. Not all of them, but some of them. But that brought a lot of news and some renewed serious work among people interested in this topic. Now, interest is changing, there's no doubt about that, and it can make it feel like interest is dying out. But that's a natural thing for any historical topic after a couple decades. And interestingly enough, I'm going to show you, well, first of all, when you look at this, you can tell in November this thing tends to have peaks, and then that peak dies out, and the low point is usually December, January, into the summer, and then interest starts to pick up again. And that's just a cyclical thing when it comes to the Kennedy assassination. Now, another topic I'm interested in is the Vietnam War. And I was surprised when I looked at this, because I thought interest in this was growing. That Ken Burns documentary came out the other year and got massive promotion all over the place. And there's a lot of books that are being written and sold, and they're doing very well about the Vietnam War. It's a topic I'm interested in because I'm actually writing a book about it. So that's doing a lot of research into it, reading these things, and being real engaged in this topic. But there's also a lot of Vietnam veterans who are now in their 70s who are writing their memoirs, sometimes self-publishing them. And there's a magazine about the Vietnam War that has over 30,000 subscribers. So there's huge interest in the Vietnam War, well, I thought right now, but the interest is actually not growing, it's been steady. Much like the Kennedy assassination, the interest in that's not dying off. likewise, the interest in the Vietnam War is not exploding, although I must admit I thought it was growing. So we can have these perceptions that interest is changing when it's not really happening. And there is a pattern to historical events and how they evolve in time with people and with historians and descendants and so forth. That's what I want to first talk about with you. So I first got interested in the Kennedy assassination when I was a teenager in around 1990, 89, 87, something like that. And I wasn't born or alive when Kennedy was killed. My parents were, and and then I read like 30 books or so, and I went away to college and ended up getting a master's degree in history. I was in a PhD program and dropped out, and then when 9/11 happened, I decided I didn't want to read about American history for a while, much less the Kennedy assassination. I like to read, and I like to read history. So I just got into another topic for about 2 years, and that was ancient Rome and ancient Greece. My thinking was that, hey, after 9/11, we're obviously an American empire now. They declare it on TV and boast about it. So I want to learn, maybe I should go back and think about empires in general. So I dove into ancient works, classics, Plutarch, Polybius, Tacitus, and Livy, and so forth. And I learned something that can apply to understanding historical events. Those ancient authors, almost all of them wrote about events that happened 70 years before they were writing about them. And they had the ability to talk with people who were directly in the battles or observed the battles or had parents that were in the battles that they were writing about. And they also had records of access to records of ancient Rome, the annals and so forth. So they had an evidentiary record, but they had this direct information, ability to interview people, whether it was secondhand or firsthand. And after 100 years, almost no one would any longer write about the events because they didn't have that type of direct information or secondary information anymore. Oral sources, the oral history vanishes after the second generation. And if we think about American historical events, something similar actually happens, where if you take like the Civil War, right now, there are people alive who had grandfathers that were in the Civil War. Not a whole lot, but some. And I know a few people. And these grandparents are obviously passed away. But by having those grandparents, these people I know, they have a connection to the Civil War, even though it was 140 years ago now. So you think about it, if someone's 80 years old, they could have had a parent that was 20 years old or about, just about during the time of the Civil War. And these people, because, they could have had a grandparent. These people, because they had a grandparent today, have an emotional connection to the Civil War that their kids will never have, and no one else will ever have from now on. So when a historical event happens, and you can think of World War II in this way too, the people directly involved in the event obviously have the biggest emotional connection to that event, but their kids can too. and so can their grandkids if they end up knowing them. But after that third generation, these emotional connections are gone. They just pass away with time. So that's the moment we're actually at now with the Civil War. Very few people have an emotional connection to the Civil War anymore. It's just a small number of people, in their late 70s or older that are going to have it. And when they end up passing away, all emotional connection to the Civil War is gone. In World War II, the same process will happen to that when people my age pass away. And so if we think of the Kennedy assassination, the same thing is going to end up happening to that. And that can make people afraid. Well, as a historical event, no one's going to care anymore. Well, I would assert that's not going to be the case. It's just that the type of emotional investment that some people feel about the event, for good reasons, that will fade away. But as a historical event, I believe the Kennedy assassination was so important, much like the Civil War was a key event of the century before, so will the Kennedy assassination and I think the Vietnam War be seen as key events of the latter half of the 20th century, perhaps for the whole world. Certainly the Kennedy administration. And it's more than simply an assassination. So one fear people have that the topic is going to die out is the power of the mainstream media. And there have been people in the mainstream media over the years that have said things like, well, Lee Harvey Oswald is a lone person, so anyone who thinks otherwise or cares about this is just, has an emotional investment in President Kennedy, and that's going to go away, so therefore the interest in the assassination is going to go away. Well, first of all, anyone who spends much time going into this quickly sees there's so many problems with the Warren Commission report that the mainstream media story and the Warren Commission story is just not believable. And these people in the future, 100 years from now, historians or anyone interested, they're going to look at the Warren Commission report. They're going to look at the literature people wrote about it as a main source. They're not going to go and turn on some TV program from 1990 or something. And we're in a funny moment anyway, where the power of the mainstream media is, for good or bad, fading away. First of all, we have the rise of this meme of fake news. Everything is fake news, the President of the United States declares about network television and the newspapers. Everything is fake news. And a lot of people believe that because of not just the Kennedy assassination, but events that have happened afterwards that have not been adequately reported on or warned about, such as the stock market crash of 2008 or the Iraq War or 9/11, for that matter. But then there's a second problem that comes as a result of that, and that is that there's massive disinformation. The vacuum of trust has been filled by people who are misinforming people, who are just don't even care in many cases if what they say is right or wrong, and just want clicks or attention or fame. And that's the real obstacle to people seriously interested in this case and who want real answers and want real information getting out. And the real obstacle now is not the mainstream media, but it is those who distort and who just put out so much junk that the good information gets lost in the junk. And the only thing anyone can do about that is just keep going on and putting out good stuff. and thinking and knowing that in time that that will remain and the junk will fade away or be discarded. And it's my hope that just my small effort with this YouTube channel can play a role in that by getting away from some of the bad information and trying to focus on the good information and those that are putting out good information. Because right now there are people doing very serious research into this case, and every year there's new information that is put out in a form digestible to the general public. Just now, just the other week, a new book by John Newman has come out in his series, and I got it. I haven't read it yet, but I got it, and I plan on reading it next week and get his entire series. And he's got more to come. So it's an exciting effort, and it's based on the files. And as someone who's a historian and interested in studying this, and I believe the files are really the key because over time, witness testimony isn't that useful. People have bad memories, and I think the only real solid stuff comes from government records. I think some answers, hopefully, can be made in the next couple of years, but there's a lot more work for people to do, and I think that's where we are as far as this being a historical event. Serious work being done, answers can come as a result of that work. But interest is not going to die out because even 100 years from now or 200 years from now, people are going to look back on the time of the Kennedy assassination as one of the most critical moments, not simply in the history of the United States, but for perhaps the entire history of humanity. So we can think of the Civil War as being a key event in the evolution of the United States as a country, the end of slavery, massive event. It changed the United States in many ways. But the Kennedy presidency may not, at first glance, transform the country like the Civil War did, but some huge things happened during the Kennedy presidency. The biggest one being the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that's the only moment in human history where we almost wiped ourselves out as a species. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity ever came to nuclear war, and people don't really know how close we came. Very few people know. But I believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a result of a nuclear arms race that happened when Harry Truman dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. A nuclear arms race began with the Soviet Union as a part of the Cold War. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was basically a result of that arms race. And President Kennedy basically said that. He told someone soon afterwards, this is all about the imbalance of power and jockeying around by the Soviets and Americans as a result. That's what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there are people inside the American government, mainly some members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are willing to go all the way, and would have been a complete catastrophe. But that's the only time the human species came to such a moment. And that moment will therefore always be something to be looked at and studied as long as people are walking on the earth. And in the Vietnam War is similar in a way, because it was a type of warfare that kind of sums up perhaps the Kennedy assassination, Cuban Missile Crisis do. All three of these events, I believe, have some sort of connection to one another, but the Vietnam War kind of epitomizes the type of warfare that the United States became involved in after World War II, and still is today, using mass bombing primarily, and it's basically a trajectory. Bombing beginning in World War II, and then more and more of a focus on bombing and less of a focus on holding territory, on having big land forces and so forth. But the Vietnam War went on for a long time, and I think was also a consequence of the Cold War and even the nuclear arms race. In fact, Robert McNamara called it, to quote, a Cold War operation. And I think the Kennedy assassination must be seen or linked to the Cold War too. So, and what is the Cold War? It was a dynamic between two nation states, one becoming a global superpower, one really a regional power, but an apparent global superpower when it really wasn't one, basically, even back then. But it's a key dynamic if you want to understand how nation states interact with one another. And the nation state itself is not something that existed throughout all human history. It's really something that, as we know it, with mass citizenship, mass armies, really came to rise after 1800, the first 20 years after 1800, with the rise of the United States and France. Mass armies, conscription, voting, and so forth. So the nation state itself is a relatively new phenomena in human history if you think of the evolution of people. So if you start stepping back away from the emotional connection you may feel about President Kennedy or his assassination, having been alive at the time, or knowing people directly affected by the events that came afterward, or so forth. If you push that aside and think of, well, what would it be like if it's 500 years from now, and I'm looking back on the time we live in now. If you go in a time machine, why would the events be important now? Why did I feel like it was important after 9/11 to read about ancient Rome and ancient Greece? Because they were empires, and I came to conclude I live in an empire, and maybe the best way to understand that is to jump out of what's on television and read about how empires worked in the past. And in fact, political scientists today will still read Thucydides to find the answer to such questions, and they may, that work about the Peloponnesian War may have the best answers to that question than anyone's ever written, even though it's 1,000 years old. So events, interpretations of events, writings about events, they're part of human culture, and that's why this is interesting. This is not going to go away. It's not going away. It's just evolving and changing. What's really perhaps important, I said at the beginning, we have to keep the interest alive by sharing the information, by getting more people engaged in it. But it might be what's really the most important thing is to do the work or share the work of others that are doing real work into this, so that the understanding of it as it evolves, not just next week, but over time, is closest to the truth as possible. So in that sense, it's really a fight, not so much against the mainstream media, whose interpretation is not even believed by many people, but against disinformation people, or people just throwing junk out there that they don't care if it's true or not. Because we want understanding to be closest to what really happened and why is this really important. So anyway, that's my rant for today, and I'll have a guest on the next episode, And thanks for letting me say those things. And subscribe to this YouTube channel and buy my book, The War State. If what I've said interests you at all and you haven't read it yet, go grab it. It's on Amazon.com. Just go there, type The War State, and buy it and get it and read it. Check out the reviews before you do. Make sure that you think this might be something you like. I think you'll see the reviews. Just about everyone likes the book, so you should like it too. So go there and grab it, and I'll talk with you later.